Question number 5, the Right Honourable Winston Peters.
Supplementary question. Kia ora, tēnā koutou katoa.
Kia ora.
This question is to the Prime Minister. Does he stand by all his statements?
The Right Honourable Prime Minister.
Mr. Speaker, yes, and just in case the member was up all night wondering what the answer was to yesterday's question,
Order.
we got to answer it. The answer was yes as well then.
Point of order.
Order.
Mr. Speaker,
A point of order. The Right
What
Honourable.
happened to the rule about not relitigating your rulings? Perhaps we could have that, eh?
Order. Strictly speaking, the member who raises the point of order was absolutely right. It would have been far more helpful to the order of the House if the Prime Minister would just answer the question without referring to any incident yesterday. Supplementary question.
That's
the
right,
Honourable
yesterday as
Winston
well.
Peters.
Why? Lighten up, chaps. Why, when he said in 2010, and these are his famous words, "I'd hate to see New Zealanders as tenants in their own country," end of quotes, has he then proceeded to remove through policies and trade deals all powers that this Parliament has to stop that very thing happening?
The Right
I'll get around to you
Honourable
especially later.
Right Honourable Prime Minister.
Mr. Speaker, I'm not entirely sure what the question is, but the answer is it's nonsense what the member said.
Hello, Speaker.
Point of order.
Speaker, can I repeat the question? Can I repeat the question?
Well, on this case, I think I've got to allow it. If the Prime Minister just, without referring to the question, order. I'm going to allow the member to repeat his question.
Speaker, why, when he said in 2010, quotes, "I'd hate to see New Zealanders as tenants in their own country," has he then proceeded to remove through policies and trade deals all powers that this Parliament has to stop that very thing happening?
Right Honourable Prime Minister.
Mr. Speaker, in answer to the first part of the question, because it's true, in answer to the second part of the question, the member was talking nonsense.
Supplementary question, the Right Honourable Winston Peters.
Is it not a fact that after the China FTA and now the Korean FTA, that this Parliament does not have any power to ban Chinese or Koreans from buying up Kiwi land and homes?
The Right Honourable Prime Minister.
Speaker, the advice I've had is because Labor negotiated the most favoured nation status in the China FTA, as a result of the Korean FTA, yes, the member's right, we wouldn't be able to ban Koreans and then ultimately Chinese nationals from buying residential property in New Zealand.
Supplementary question.
Order. I just need order.
Prime Minister,
Order.
has he not admitted already that
Order. I'm still on my feet trying to get some silence from my left. The supplementary question, Right Honourable Winston Peters.
Prime Minister, has he not admitted already that one of the consequences of the TPPA negotiations thus far will be that the power of Parliament to ban the sale of houses and land to non-residents in TPPA nations will be completely and utterly extinguished?
The Right Honourable Prime Minister.
Mr. Speaker, I wouldn't want to say that today because TPP hasn't been concluded. There may be implications in terms of bans, but as the government said, and as I said during the weekend, actually we don't favour a ban on sale of residential property or land. We think there are far better ways of addressing that. And actually, Mr. Speaker, when one looks at the countries that actually have bans, they're very small and they don't work. When you look at the countries that don't have extensive restrictions, have policies similar to New Zealand, it's a very, very long list.
Supplementary question, Right Honourable Winston Peters.
Is he happy to go down in history as the leader who did his best to hand over the powers and rights of this Parliament to foreign governments and to put the welcome foreign buyer sign up for Kiwi land and homes?
Right Honourable Prime Minister.
Well, Mr. Speaker, I think history will remember me for many things, I'm sure, but not that. And, Mr. Speaker, if the member really did have to wait 24 hours to ask that question, gosh, it must have been much of a wait, really.
Supplementary question, the Right Honourable Winston Peters.
Is it not a fact, Prime Minister, that the government's present public relations softening up strategy is because, as Prime Minister, on the TPPA, he has utterly sold this country out?
The Right Honourable Prime Minister.
Mr. Speaker, no. Speaker, up until very recently, actually, both Labor and National could see enormous benefits of having a free trade agreement with the first and fourth largest economies in the world. Both Labor and National could see that for our companies, large and small around New Zealand, being able to compete in those very, very large and wealthy markets without our hands tied behind our back would be of enormous success. Both Labor and National have seen over the history of time that free trade has massively advanced this country. The only party that believes, and we can see, of the Neanderthal policies that the member is promoting is New Zealand First and the Greens. And frankly, even though they hate each other, they deserve each other.
Question number 6.
Mr. Speaker.
Order. Order.
Point of order, Speaker.
Point of order, the right honourable.
This House will be, first of all, disorderly and brought into disrepute. If a Prime Minister is allowed to get up and say that one party hates another party or its members, that surely is not parliamentary for a start,
Order.
And it's not true.
Order. Order. The member's now had his say, but when I look at the question and an accusation that another party's selling out the country, it gives a fair amount of licence to the answer that's been given. Question number 6. Order. Order. I've made a ruling. There's no need for the member to continue to interject. Question number 6, the Honourable Annette King.